affordable housing component, then Washtenaw County, certainly then Oakland County. And I think this is relevant because when you're looking at where most of the people are either coming to Washtenaw County, coming to Ann Arbor, they're actually, if you look at the data, they're actually coming from Grand Rapids. They're coming from Kent County. So you have more inflow of people that are coming from Kent County into Washtenaw County than from anywhere else. And they are dealing with a sort of different housing affordability component. And I think it's relevant to look at this from everything is always relative as you're talking about housing, depending on what you're dealing with. And the story I like to tell is that a few years ago, Toyota was bringing up several hundred people that they were moving from a facility that they had in northern Kentucky, and they were going to have them move into their Ann Arbor facilities. And at the same time, they're also bringing people from the design center, which happened to be outside of Los Angeles, into the Ann Arbor area. And we scheduled these bus tours, and we were like introducing people and like letting people know about the community and literally taking them on buses and going around the place. And one of the things that they wanted to look at was housing, because when people learned in northern Kentucky that they were going to be moving to Ann Arbor, they typed in Ann Arbor houses on Zillow, and they had sticker shock. And on the other hand, and so then we took them to various places around the community where the housing might be a little bit more affordable and happened to not be in places in Washtenaw County, frankly. On the other hand, we had folks that were moving from the design center, and they moved into some of the most expensive markets in Ann Arbor and loved it that they had a backyard for the first time for their kids, for example. So it's always relative when you're having these conversations about housing affordability. So I think it's relevant in terms of where you sit is where you stand on some of these things. This data, obviously, we've done 2019 is the most recent version of this, but you can see that it is trending upward. You can see that Washtenaw County is above the national average in terms of housing affordability, and just that's ticking up over time. And then one of the factors that I also wanted to show you here, and this is new data that we'll be putting in our next version of the benchmarking report that we're going to be publishing, is just looking at rental rates for across our competitive set. So not only just looking at housing from purchasing a home standpoint, but also from the rental class, because I think it's relevant for to understand this component as well, since this is where a lot of people are starting their careers, or if you don't have the affordability opportunity to try and purchase a home. So we want to have some context around this, and we also have the data as it relates to the housing affordability for rental rates as it compares to other Michigan markets as well. But the final piece is, I think what's relevant from sort of what our employers are telling us is, we've simply asked in the past, tell us where your employees live. And the way that we sort of pitch this is that we have a larger talent reach as it relates to where talent could come from if they're going to locate a company or trying to grow in the Ann Arbor area. So this was simply just doing a zip code analysis of where people live that were working for a specific company in town. And you can see, obviously, there's hotspots within Washtenaw County, but you can also notice that there are a significant number of people that live along the 275 corridor that are in Wayne and Oakland County. There are people that are moving or are coming in from Flint. In certain cases, we have people that are coming in from Canada, from Northern Ohio. So there's, in the past, especially when this was a non-remote work component, there was a lot of people that were driving into the area, which A, causes traffic congestion, and B, I think, frankly, can sometimes also cause people to consider, okay, we're having everyone import from the 275 corridor right now. Is there some way that we should think about our business location more strategically for where those folks live, simply from an affordability standpoint? And we'll have other conversations where we say, tell us where your employees live. And they're like, yeah, they can't actually live in the community where we work. And we have to consider and think about transportation for those folks as they're going to come into town, all these other factors to sort of overcome the limited supply of housing that might be available for them overall. So I think those are a couple considerations that I wanted to just try and share from a data perspective that we try and put together over time, and to give a little bit of context for some of the conversations that we've been having. And like I said, I think this is becoming more and more of a focus for business owners to have to consider, and for us to think about from an economic development standpoint, because I think it has strategic implications for the community moving forward. So with that, I cede my time to Maura.
Just one quick question. I know, Phil, like in some of the conversations that Sparks had with the Public Affairs Committee, or whatever we're called, you were talking about that housing might be one of the things that you put in the strategic plan for Spark. So how would that look, or kind of how does that play out when you think about it from the economic development perspective?
Yeah, so it's like I mentioned, it's becoming more and more of a topic of consideration that we have to consider. And I think the factor that you have to think about it from the economic development perspective is how can you try and influence that in some way. And I think, at least in my mind, maybe not determining where that's going to go from a strategic planning perspective, but I think there's at least some data that we can try and provide and contextualize this in a broader sense. Some of the things that we've already started to do in terms of like, let's have some baseline metrics for what this can look like. And also, I think the other onion that we should try and unpack here is what housing affordability looks like from different components of the population. So one of the things that we included in our last data set, for example, was benchmarking the gaps and looking at housing affordability from a race standpoint. So what is it from white residents? What is it for people of color? And how does housing affordability look like that's different from a perspective related to that? And I think that we just have to start, I think from the perspective of where I think we can go from an EDO, from an economic development organization standpoint, that's a stepping stone, and it could create some larger conversation and hopefully some awareness around the issue. I think Lynn has a question.
Hi, Phil.
Hi.
Hi. I for very geeky reasons, had watched Sterling Heights, a Sterling Heights City Council meeting last year. And what really struck me was a presentation by the city administrator, and he presented the 2021 equalization data, where it was the top 5 cities in Michigan, and it ranked by property class, with rankings by property class, where Ann Arbor was first in residential and second overall. And it was Ann Arbor along with Grand Rapids, Troy, Sterling Heights, and Detroit. Do you think, I have a screenshot of that of that part of the meeting, but maybe in the future it'd be interesting to see if we could see like the equalization data according to like residential, commercial, industrial, personal, just so that I think we forget to affordability and housing is part of that discussion. You know, I think it's helpful to see how our struggle is compared to other cities where other folks are also struggling with housing issues, but because we have the state's largest employer based here, it throws us off a little bit. But I don't know, maybe there are other folks who like to look at these classes, residential.
I think actually it's a great point. We also do some work in Livingston County, and one of the metrics that we had provided to Livingston County was their ratio of commercial industrial property to residential. Especially in Livingston County, it's a bedroom community. It's a bedroom community to Washtenaw County, frankly, and to other places. So I think it's a good metric to bring up. I mean, maybe from my perspective, I don't find that geeky at all. I think that's something that should be on everyone's mind as well. So that's absolutely some data that could be included.
Sterling Heights City Council meetings are shorter than Ann Arbor's, so should anyone have time and interest. All right, thank you. Thank you for considering that request.
Did anyone else have questions they wanted to I shouldn't say lob, gently present to Phil, either from the audience? You could type them into the Q&A. You can also do it while he's talking and I'll moderate it, or Teresa will moderate it, or any of the HHSAB board members wanted to ask any questions. Oh, I have the wrong view. I can't actually see hands. Hold on. Oh, there we go. Okay. All right. Well, seeing no one, Maura, would you like to take it from here?
Sure. Let me just share my screen. Okay, can everybody see that? We're good. Okay, so Phil and I did not coordinate this, but I knew I could count on him to provide the data because I am not providing data. So thank you, Phil. This worked out well. So hi, everybody. Thank you for having me here tonight. I'm really pleased to be with you all. Again, I'm Maura Thompson. I'm the communications manager at the Downtown Development Authority. Prior to that, I was the director of the Main Street Area Association, which is one of the 4 business associations in downtown Ann Arbor. So I worked really closely with small businesses for about 13 years, and I continue to work with them. So I've been around downtown for quite a while. So tonight, what I'm going to do is give an overview of the challenges that I've observed our small business community facing over the last few years. So first, just really quick, Downtown Development Authority, we are part of the city of Ann Arbor. Our mission is to undertake public improvements that have the greatest impact in strengthening the downtown area and attracting new private investments. We are guided by a development plan, and our goal is to be a catalyst for economic health and quality of life within our downtown and, of course, in our community. We focus on a number of different areas, and I just want to touch upon a few here. Transportation, we run the city's public parking system. We also fund the Go Pass, which is unlimited rides on the AAATA for all downtown employees, and we work to improve pedestrian and non-motorized transportation. We take on large infrastructure projects within our downtown. Most recently, those projects fall under an umbrella we call people-friendly streets. You might be familiar with some of those projects. We have 3 protected bike lanes on William Division and First. And really the goal of all of these projects is to make our streets safe, accessible for all people of all ages, all abilities, no matter what your mode of transportation is. Housing is also something that the DDA has had a long-standing commitment to supporting. For probably close to 20 years, we funded around $6 million for various projects for organizations like Avalon Housing, the Ann Arbor Housing Commission, Delana Center, Dawn Farm. And most of those projects have been rehab and work on existing affordable units. And currently, what we're really excited about is a partnership with the Housing Commission to bring new units to our downtown. And I'll touch on that in a few slides. But really, the DDA recognizes the value of having a full spectrum of housing options downtown. And in support of our business community, it's not only for their customer base, but for employees. So just to kind of bring it to what we're talking about tonight and kind of the intersection between the challenges small business face and affordable housing and public transportation. So I went back to, I know you are all very familiar with this document. The Office of Community and Economic Development commissioned this analysis back in 2015. And one of the conclusions in this analysis is that within Washtenaw County, we have 2 very distinct housing markets. We've got Ann Arbor and Ypsilanti. And this kind of lack of balance we have in our county, they did predict in this study that it would lead to problems. And certainly things are unfolding as was predicted in that study. Housing cost increases are going to so outpace income that gains that affordability will be a real challenge in the future. And I think, we all know that that certainly came to fruition. So stepping back to this time in the small business community in downtown Ann Arbor, right around 2015-ish, especially in the service industry, business owners really started to see the labor market tighten. Their usual recruitment strategies, they weren't working anymore. So typically they would recruit from students, University of Michigan, Eastern, WCC, and there was a lot of word of mouth. There's a real tight-knit community of service industry workers. So if you needed an employee, you could tell someone who worked for you, and you didn't really have a problem getting employees. Well, right around this time, that kind of started to evaporate. At the same time, the Michigan unemployment rate was dropping, real estate values were rising. Short-term rentals like the Airbnbs and Verbos were becoming more and more popular, particularly in the downtown area. And affordable properties within our downtown really started to turn over. And I'm just showing an example here. This is 2014 on North First Street. And if you know downtown, you know that sort of North First, North Ashley, some of those areas in downtown used to have some somewhat affordable housing, older homes, multiple units, some places that were affordable for people working downtown. They could walk, they could walk downtown, walk to work. So this was 2014. This is the 400 block of North First. This is the 400 block of North First today. This is obviously a beautiful luxury condo unit, and there are probably, I don't know, 3 or 4 units kind of similar to that within, I don't know, a couple of blocks. So certainly these units, as lovely as they are not affordable to our service industry employees. So back to this time, the downtown community, we were really struggling to find solutions. Exploring different recruiting options. I remember as the person running the Main Street Area Association, we brought in a local restaurateur who I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with, who has really good luck recruiting in the recovery community. So we brought her in to the Main Street Area Association to speak to our businesses about how they could tap into that resource. We also brought in Washtenaw Intermediate School District, had a program, and perhaps they still do, connecting adults with disabilities with employers. We brought that group in to talk to our businesses. Businesses had to change their expectations. I remember bumping into a restaurateur who owned one of my favorite restaurants downtown that is no longer in business, who had kind of a carefully curated wait staff. He was really selective on who he would hire. And I bumped into him downtown one day, and he said that he not only was not doing in-person interviews, he was doing interviews over the phone. He was hiring sight unseen and hoping they would show up. It just had really changed the labor market. Destination Ann Arbor, our local convention and visitors bureau, actually began a workforce development program. They hired somebody to come in to try to work on finding solutions to this problem that we were facing downtown. So all of this was great. These were great efforts, but really it wasn't getting to the crux of the problem, because affordable housing and public transportation are the key to finding and retaining employees. And for the hospitality and service industry, employees simply can no longer afford to live in or around downtown Ann Arbor. So let's fast forward to the pandemic. So this is March of 2020. Clearly the bottom had fallen out of what was already a pretty fragile downtown ecosystem. So all of the problems that small businesses were facing were now exaggerated by these additional challenges related to the pandemic. So unemployment benefits, you know, it was great. Unemployment benefits were really supporting people, but for a lot of employees, it made more sense to stay home. The public health risks, right? Like the business owners were concerned about customers, were concerned about employees. This photo was taken, this was June of 2020, right when restrictions were lifted, and not everybody felt comfortable coming back to work. Inconsistent and unreliable hours. If you remember back to 2020, the legislature would make some quick decisions on capacity limits, whether they would be taking them off or on, but it was really difficult for employers because there wasn't any consistency for employees. You didn't know how many hours you were going to get a week. And then, of course, AAATA was forced to reduce frequency and service. So if you relied exclusively on public transportation, you were pretty much out of luck. And then, of course, we had our issues with daycare centers being closed, public schools are virtual. If you were a lower paid hourly worker, it was pretty much impossible for you to make ends meet at this time and put it all together and get to work without transportation, without any childcare. Things got really tough and still are. So what can we do? And I'll go back to the analysis that was done in 2015. And one of the things that was stated that it makes sense to focus the development of affordable units in areas with transportation choices. So for some good news, I feel like we are headed in the right direction. So the Affordable Housing Millage, of course, that was huge. The great work that the Ann Arbor Housing Commission is doing on downtown properties, city-owned properties. This is in a job center adjacent to a transit hub. So this is great. And the DDA is supporting both of those projects. The 4th and Catherine project will be upsizing a water main, taking on streetscape work, doing something similar on 350 South 5th. So we're really proud to be partnering with the Housing Commission on these projects. And then the city's new zoning district, the transit corridor zoning. I think this is really exciting. New zoning along existing transit corridors. So hopefully we'll be developing some areas where traditionally you wouldn't have seen any housing, and perhaps we'll have more of a choice in housing options as far as price points. And you can see the corridor here, State Eisenhower, I think is the first corridor that they're looking at. I know it was approved by Planning Commission, and I believe it still has to get through council. And then there's the RIDE's long range plan, the RIDE 2045. I'm really excited about this. I think that public transportation is not only a key for helping us deal with some of these issues, but of course also a key to helping fighting climate change. And we know that our city has an ambitious climate neutrality goal, the 820 plan, to reach carbon neutrality by 2030. And to do that, we have to reduce VMT by 50%. So we have got to work on our public transportation. And from what I've heard, I know the RIDE has had a few engagement sessions, and they're really looking for transformational change. They're looking to broaden the network of high frequency service. They're looking to expand off-peak service. They're looking for better transfers, and they're looking for bus rapid transit, which we know means dedicated bus lanes. And I think that that this is going to be a community conversation that we have, but in order to reach our our carbon neutrality goals, we are going to have to make it a little bit more attractive to get on a bus than get in your car. And I think that dedicated bus lanes are a great step in that direction. And public transportation is really personal to me. So I just have to share what you're looking at here is the orange line. That is the MBTA, otherwise known as the T, is the public transit system in the Boston area. So I grew up in a city right outside of Boston, and I grew up without any money and without a car. But what I did have was incredible public transportation. And I never appreciated it at the time. But now looking back, I realized this was my key to opportunity. This gave me the ability to get a job. It gave me access to healthcare. And I think about raising my kids here in Ann Arbor. I was fortunate enough to have a car. I had 3 kids who did all sorts of different activities that I drove them around to all the time. And I would often think how if you don't have a car because of your economic situation, for your children, they certainly don't have the same opportunities as other children. So I'm a real supporter of public transportation, but I'll get off my soapbox now. So my last slide, I just think the combination of affordable housing and public transportation is just a powerful solution in addressing so many of our issues, labor shortages, climate change, racial and economic disparities, and just quality of life for people in our community, to have access to jobs, healthcare, education, recreation, entertainment, to get your food. I think those 2 things together can make our community a better place. And that's all I have.
Thank you. Just a quick reminder to all of our big audience, please use the Q&A function to enter your questions in, and then we can read them off for you for the panelists is what works best. So it's it says Q&A, and then it has 2 little speech bubbles on the bottom of your Zoom screen. Do any board members have any questions they'd like to ask Maura?
Can I just maybe jump in on one piece? Because when Mara was talking about her experience and her personal experience in Boston, it got me thinking of actually about a conversation I had. I had an opportunity a couple of years ago to talk to the economic development person in Boulder County, Colorado. And I had sort of, were akin in terms of similar population size to Ann Arbor. And I felt like they were like a few years ahead in terms of development overall from where Ann Arbor could be going. And I wanted to have a conversation, just kind of pick his brain a little bit to figure out what was his perspective on that piece as we're looking outside at other communities. And I was like, what's your biggest issue that you have right now? And his point was, he's like, the median sale price for a home in Boulder right now is reaching $1 million. The biggest issue I have right now is housing supply as it relates to getting anything to be able to come in, like increase the capacity of people that want to live there, increase the capacity of people that wanted to be employed there. That was his main sort of issue. So I think as it relates to, great perspective to try and think around other communities that we can try and learn from. And as it relates to one of the challenges that we could be heading towards, and if you look at the list there, Boulder County is the second highest behind Silicon Valley on sort of our list in terms of housing affordability and it being very expensive. We could be heading towards that way if we're not trying to focus on this issue and think about it from, frankly, from a supply issue. We're kind of to pick up on that point. So I just wanted to underscore that piece.
Do we, sort of thinking across Phil's presentation and yours, Maura, there's this piece about in the 2015 report that highlights the relationship between Ann Arbor's housing market and IPSI's housing market and the way that the two sort of press on each other. Have you sort of gave this update from 2015 till now and what the DDA has seen about with where workers have lived, which I've observed in my personal life and my friends. I was a barista downtown, and most of my colleagues had to ride the bus in on Washington Avenue from IPSI because that was rent. And I'm wondering if you've seen, if you can speak to maybe how things have changed or intensified in that dynamic in where service workers are living. I'm sort of picturing Phil's graphic of, living, in the Detroit suburbs and then commuting in and where we know people are commuting in from for service jobs.
Yeah, I can't say with any certainty. I can tell you over the last 2 years with the pandemic, I think Ypsilanti is still a big draw, but it's the numbers have just dropped. I mean, I know one restaurateur who he and his wife are probably close to 70, who are now working 6 days a week. They're in the kitchen, they're cooking, they're doing dishes, so I don't think we've had a big shift in where employees are coming from. I think we've just had kind of an evaporation of them actually taking jobs. So sorry, I can't give more specifics than that, but yeah.
Okay. We have a couple questions. So the first is about the need to reduce VMT. So thank you so much for talking about the need to reduce VMT in order to meet carbon neutrality goals. Do you feel that focusing on electrification risks deprioritizing resources from service expansion?
Is that question for me?
If you feel like you can answer it, then yes.
Yeah, I mean, my point on reducing VMT was really emphasizing the need to prioritize our public transportation. I think the EV conversation is a different conversation. I mean, I can talk from the DDA perspective. We're partnering with the Office of Sustainability to install 80 new EV chargers in our parking structures downtown, but I think that's probably, I'm totally not the expert on that.
Can you, on behalf of all of us who are rusty on our acronym game, remind us of what VMT stands for?
Vehicle miles traveled.
Gotcha.
Basically, we need to get people out of their single occupancy vehicle cars, right? Like we all need, well, one good example I know our transportation manager at the city often uses when he's talking about this is, we need to reduce our VMT to reach our carbon neutrality goals. And we did it during the pandemic, right? Like from, April to, I don't know, August, we did it, we can do it. But we have to make some changes.
Another question that is DDA specific. How is the DDA thinking about the long-term viability of the downtown street closures? How can they be leveraged to the betterment of downtown businesses?
Yeah, so the DDA's role in the street closure program was to fund it and to help coordinate it. And I actually sit on the board of the Main Street Area Association, which is one of the business associations that coordinated those street closures. And I can tell you that they are planning on bringing those closures back in some capacity this spring. So I think moving forward, it will be a business association driven initiative. And I know we have some council members here. It'll be up to council whether or not those street closures get approved. But I think, the DDA's role was COVID support related.
Oh, Jennifer, you're here. Great. I have a question about transportation and the jobs to homes dynamic and the relationship between these housing conversations and affordable housing developments that are up and coming. So there was a really wonderful thread. Well, I found it very tear-evoking thread about the implications, particularly for women and particularly women with children, of transportation that isn't a car and the accessibility of that transportation and what it means to have to get on and off a bus when you've got children and you're doing school drop-offs and you're trying to get to work. And maybe that work is downtown as a server and you just have to coordinate all of this. And I'm wondering what conversations happen between a group like the Ann Arbor Housing Commission and the DDA or the RIDE, and Mario can speak for them, and around how we advocate for transportation for people moving into those houses, and what kind of conversations happen. You're muted, Jennifer.
Sorry about that. The type of housing that we're currently looking at building in the downtown is a bit different than what we've traditionally built as traditional like public housing. So we have some what we would call mid-rise apartments like Miller Manor and Baker Commons that are primarily single family households, sometimes couples. And then we have low-rise, townhomes, primarily families, but also could be small families or larger families that are more out in neighborhoods, not near the downtown. So in our thinking about what we're doing and building in the downtown, it does feel like that forces us, at least in a community the size of Ann Arbor. We're not New York City, we're not San Francisco, we're a smaller community, to think about that type of housing being not family oriented, more for people who don't have to get their kids to schools, et cetera. And so when we think about the transportation piece, it's people who are self-selecting to live in a downtown that does not require them to have a car. If they need a car, if they need to be able to, use a car on a daily basis, it's not really the best choice, especially for affordable housing. So we're thinking about, well, how do you, in addition to public transportation, what about the times when you do need a car? Because there are times when it's, challenging to be on public transportation if you're doing a major shopping trip or something like that. And so we're looking at doing shared EV shared cars, similar to what's available in the marketplace, but at much reduced rates, highly subsidized, that are for the people who are living downtown, but not a lot of them, maybe 2 or 3 for every 50 people, something like that. When I've talked to our residents, who've been a mixture of families and single adults about the housing projects that we're looking at developing, the families absolutely are not happy about the idea of being in a downtown and not having a car, 100%. And I'm like, well, this is not going to be family housing, because it's just different, especially if you have a lot of kids. We find our family sites have multiple vehicles, as opposed to our single adult sites rarely have vehicles. And especially I think in these new sites, we'll rarely have vehicles. So those are the kind of conversations we're having about the properties that we're looking at that are particularly in the downtown. We do have a few sites that are outside the downtown that will have different conversations.
Thank you. Did any other, Anna, you've joined in, do any of the HHSAB board members or council members, I know we also have, oh, maybe I'm wrong. We missed a council member in the attendee zone. Did any of you have questions that you wanted to pose to either of our guests? Okay, I have another question. Phil, when you were looking, you mentioned how housing and the affordability of housing impacts is playing a larger role in the conversations you're having with businesses who might be thinking about expanding their workforce here or moving some of their workforce here from elsewhere. Do those conversations, I mean, how do, U of M is a very transient population, like a lot of the people are coming and going and there's just a lot of turnover. And I wonder how the cost of housing impacts how long the companies that choose to come in here, how long their employees choose to stay, and whether, the lack of affordability might have a greater impact, say if it's an early career person who's fine with living in a 1 or 2 bedroom apartment, but might not want to choose to stay here if they can't find a place that they would want to have a family. And then if you're doing like exit interviews about companies that leave, I actually don't know of companies that leave besides Pfizer. So I don't know if there's like exit interviews about like why people do make that choice that you were suggesting about moving elsewhere along, the interstates.
I think in my experience, there's been probably a couple different ways that they thought about it when there's kind of a decision that could come up as it relates to sort of the location and where the business is located, and then where the employees are located. And in fact, in most cases, what I've seen is that companies are actually doing exactly sort of a little bit of the zip code analysis themselves, right? They'll map out where their employees actually live. And frankly, in some cases, you'll see the companies that will have a different place for where their house might be live as the owner versus where their employees live. And a lot of that can actually factor into some of the decisions that are made in terms of where that could change. And some of it is really a matter of, depending on what the wages that could come up, right? We were talking a little bit earlier during Moore's presentation around sort of the service sector component and the wages that are available for those folks and where they have to live, as opposed to people that maybe are able to command a higher wage and have some more options in terms of affordability. So I think some of it breaks down in terms of those components, but I think the honest answer is it really factors into saying, okay, where's the amount of people that we're pulling from? And you might have in sort of a more, let's say, the western side of Washington County, you might have a manufacturing company that is pulling a lot of people from Jackson. They may actually say, why don't we try and consider a move towards closer to Jackson, which is where our people happen to be, right? It's those kinds of thinking that can sometimes go on that is a little bit more of a risk when you're talking about the housing discussion in terms of where their employees are, in my experience.
Foster, if I might add, when people think about Ann Arbor in particular as housing market, and there's a wide spectrum of views on how people see this community, and sometimes it depends on how long you've lived here as well, and how you see the change. And but many people get frustrated by any kind of like high rise, high density type of development. And if you think about the marketplace, it's very basic supply and demand. You don't have enough supply, and there's a high demand, which we are exactly that description, and prices start going up. So whether or not the housing that's added is on the expensive end, whether it's owner, whether it's rental, whether it's student, it doesn't really matter. It's still adding housing to the marketplace. And with the cost to do development, like literally the cost of construction, literally the cost of hiring professionals, the cost of land, that puts that pressure to build these more expensive apartments in the downtown, for example, or condos in the downtown, but that's also freeing up space from where people are moving from. And on the other end, people get very frustrated with affordable housing, but that's also the same cost to build, the same, everything about it is expensive. The difference is there are actually subsidies out there to help subsidize that development from happening. And so if we add affordable housing and we add high-end housing, we're adding to the entire marketplace, it actually benefits all income ranges because it takes that pressure off the marketplace on the demand side. So I just wanted to put that out there.
Do we have any more questions for, Lynn? Yes.
So Phil, are there conversations around, as you speak to companies, do you hear folks talking about community development banks or CDFIs, community development financial institutions to help folks who are trying to find loans, or I guess on the more of the corporate side, maybe like community development venture capital for equity and debt equity for small and medium-sized businesses? Are there talks on how, like on the finance end?
So I'll be honest, one that probably comes up more frequently I happen to be on a credit union board, and we talk more about CDFIs and the focus on that on the credit union side than it comes up in the conversations that we have with the business owners. I think the conversations we have with them are a little more cursory, and that they're just expressing concern, expressing desire to have their employees either live closer, have more affordable or any type of housing options that their employees could live at, as opposed to then, unpacking the onion and figuring out what are the ways that they could try and impact the solution. So I haven't had any of the specific, like a CDFI discussion from that perspective, but it does come up in certainly other areas of the financing aspects around the state of Michigan, my side.
And CDFIs, when they're when their product is related to affordable housing, it's really geared toward revitalizing disinvested neighborhoods, and they have to meet certain thresholds of poverty. And so it's weirdly in Ann Arbor, we've actually talked to a few different companies and our organizations, and we haven't found a site that meets the requirements, because we're not a disinvested community with a lot of low-income households, unless you're on campus, basically.
So it's more for like distressed communities, right?
Distressed, yeah, on the affordable housing side, yeah, and the community investment side. It doesn't mean we can't make it happen someday. We're looking.
Thank you.
Oh, okay. Another question. How many units a year do we need to build I'm going to start from the top. How many units a year do we need to build to stabilize prices? How many will the Housing Commission build? And how much market rate development will we need?
That would be our other guest, who's going to be here in a couple of weeks to be able to answer that question. How much, I could tell you what we would like to do on the Housing Commission side. My goal is, before I retire in the next 8 to 10 years, is to build at least 1,000 units of affordable housing and have a pipeline going with 100 to 200 units a year, or plans, some part in the process. So I half jokingly say, but I'm actually very serious, even though the study that Maura pointed out has a goal of 2,800 units over 20 years. I think we need 10,000 units over 20 years. Will that actually happen? I don't know, but we need more than even what our own studies are showing us. But of course, the market is constantly changing as well. Just like in the last few years, it's had huge impacts. It's had huge impacts on supply side. It had huge impacts on supply cost. And so things are constantly changing. People are, able to work from home, like all kinds of weird things are happening.
And there's one last question in the chat that's actually a really great segue to to remind all of our attendees that this is an ongoing series. So this week we were talking I keep saying week. This month we've been talking to the DDA and to Ann Arbor Spark about housing downtown and the business world relation with housing. Next month's topic is going to be on different models of home ownership. So Jeff Crockett raises some interest in the cooperative housing model, and that's going to be really part of our conversation next month, and housing like Arrowwood Cooperative and whether or not we can do something like that, or even other models besides those two. And then in April, we'll be talking about sustainability, density, planning, and zoning, which feels like a lot to fit into to April. And I know that it's a popular topic for a lot of people in Ann Arbor. In May, we'll be talking about housing development and supportive housing and what it means to develop housing, and then what it means to develop supportive housing. And then in June and July, we have a double whammy of financing. And that'll probably loop back to a bunch of these conversations, including what Jennifer was just talking about. And Jeff, it'll loop back to the housing models as well. And so hopefully everyone continues to join us for the rest of the learning series. And for now, thank you so much, Maura and Phil, for joining us and answering all of our questions and spending your time with us.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Oh, I almost left. I shouldn't leave. End